I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another 30-minute skills. As a reminder, all our 30-minute skills are available at nefac.org/30-minute skills. They include classes on data cleaning, data visualization, privacy law, Microsoft Excel basics, how to diversify sources, how to protect yourself as a journalist, and many other topics. You'll also find at nefac.org a growing list of upcoming presentations and events, all focused on the First Amendment and journalism. Nearly all of them are free and open to the public, so please check them out and consider joining us. Today, we'll be discussing democracy reporting and how you can incorporate democracy-related stories into your current beats. We have a lot to cover and not a lot of time, so let's get started. Joining us today is Geoff Foster, Executive Director of Common Cause Massachusetts. Geoff, all yours.
Thanks, Justin. And hey, everyone, I'm excited for this discussion. So today we're talking about making democracy reporting part of your beat. So again, Geoff Foster, I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Massachusetts. For those who don't know, Common Cause is a national organization with many state affiliates. And we've been working for the last 50 years to make government more accessible and transparent, and really working to hold power accountable. We've been a leader in the national and state and local democracy efforts for a long time now across the United States. So it's a real thrill to bring some of our experience and knowledge to you all today as a resource. You can see here some of the specific democracy issues that we've really focused on are voting in elections, campaign finance, ethics and accountability, transparency and access, justice and democracy, and really important to today's discussion, local civic engagement. So you might be thinking, oh, well, what's local civic engagement have to do with democracy reporting? The answer is everything. We'll talk about it. So again, as Justin mentioned today, we really have three goals to leave you all with, and that is how to strengthen your beat coverage with democracy-related stories, potential sources for stories on topics relevant to democracy, and specific democracy-related story ideas that you can immediately begin working on. There's a lot going on in the democracy space right now, so really excited to share with you what we're seeing and maybe get some ideas going for how you could start reporting on it. First, I just want to start with some framing around strengthening coverage about democracy. First and foremost, I think we all know this, it's way more than politics, right? Politics is part of our democracy, which is a huge institution with many value sets. But I think when we say democracy issues, sometimes our first thought is, that it's about politics, it's about government. Yes, in part it is, but it's also a lot more. It's about government, but it's also about people, people in their community, the relationships that people have with their government, and the government with the people, the relationship that people have in their community, and the relationship that people have with other people. That level of engagement and the discourse, especially the institution of the press, brings to our democracy are also important. And I really want us to think really broadly about democracy issues and how we can report on them to be a little bit bigger than just politics. Today, I also really want to encourage you all to think about this. And I recognize many of you might have very local beats. So I really want to make sure I wasn't talking about resources, sources, and stories with maybe a big national focus. I know that's not necessarily everyone's focus. So I wanted to make this as local as we could. And also want us to think about the fact that, elections are important. It's a big part of our democracy and how people have a relationship with our governments. But I put elections are important because democracy is always happening all around us, big, small democracy. And it's not just around election season. It happens in the quote unquote off season as well. And so I'm hopeful that today's discussion will also make you think a little bit about how democracy happens outside of our elections. Also really important is to understand that we view democracy as very intersectional. Democracy is not one bucket of policy ideas, and it's not just one bucket of work. We like to think at Common Cause as working on democracy issues really lifts up all other issues. Folks who might want to advocate for housing or work against homelessness issues or work for food insecurity, all of people's interest in working on any issue benefits when we work on democracy issues. And so I would also think about, if you're working on maybe a specific issue, not necessarily related to voting in elections, that you might find a way to bring in a conversation about democracy. Maybe, how are people engaging? How are people organizing? What are people saying? How's a community coming together to make some sort of positive improvement? And that really leads us into civic engagement. And I want you all to think more about how reporting on civic engagement is reporting on democracy. The more we can measure civic engagement and the relationship that people are having with themselves and their communities, the rate at which people are getting involved in their communities as really being an indicator of the health of our democracy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about civic engagement as well. First, I want to define civic engagement. I think this is really important. And there's a really great definition that came out of the American Democracy Project, an article called Civic Responsibility in Higher Education by Thomas Ehrlich, coming through Oryx Press. And that is that civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. I'm happy to make sure these resources are available after today. This is a definition that I've always really loved because it shows not just the relationship an individual has with their community as being part of civic engagement, but it outlines what really needs to go into it. And it is the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation. And I hope that this definition can help you think a little bit broader about reporting when you're thinking about how folks are becoming civically engaged and the impact that has positively or negatively, if there's maybe we're measuring an increase in disengagement and how that relates to our democracy. So here's a few sources. There are many, many more. In fact, I would love to hear from you all as well. If you have thoughts or if you've learned in your experience that you want to share with others as well. I just wanted to make sure we kept this in time, so I synthesized this the best I can. But what you also see is I frame this in a sense of being inside and outside. And so some of you may be familiar with this term. It's commonly used a lot by community organizers. And what we're really talking about here are who are potential sources on the inside, meaning within institutions that have power to make decisions on our behalfs, and who are the potential sources on the outside, meaning groups that might not have the power or access, but who have a stake and who have an interest in maybe compelling those with power to go a certain way on any particular issue. And I really think that if we're doing healthy reporting on democracy issues, and if we're doing healthy democracy work and advocacy, we have to understand and appreciate that there's a balance between expertise of folks who might be on the inside and folks with expertise who may be on the outside. And really celebrating the fact that the variety of ideas that can come from those different perspectives all really contribute to meaningful reporting on democracy issues. This may seem really simple, but it's so important. First and foremost, I think it's so important for you all to make sure you familiarize yourself, especially locally, with the public notice process. Any government body locally at the state level, there's some sort of requirement for a public notice where the public needs to be informed and aware in advance and afterwards of how certain groups with power over all of us are making decisions that we have to live by. Especially on the local level, this is really important. You can usually find it on a municipality's website or a state's website. They're usually some sort of, we're in Massachusetts, we have specific laws here. Different states have different laws, but there's usually some sort of rule about how far in advance these need to be posted. This is a really good way to in advance know what your local government might be discussing, what the community might be bringing forward, and what people are caring about in any given moment. Added to that is, if you're really focusing on municipal matters, you're also going to want to familiarize yourself with local elected and appointed government officials, maybe building a few relationships. And not just because you want to give a platform to their political interests. That's not the value, really. The value is to help you get a sense of timing. All issues are important, but what's really important in reporting is having a sense of the timing of things. And so being able to see meeting notices in advance, being put up, helps you understand kind of what's going to come down the road here. What do we think the community is going to want to talk about next week around certain issues? Obviously, if you're getting more interested specifically in voting in elections or election administration, which is a big topic right now, you're definitely going to want to make sure you familiarize yourself with folks in your Secretary of State's office, and even more importantly, local election officials, the folks who are actually in charge of administering our elections. These are usually town or city clerks. These folks have expertise. They have an understanding of how our laws work, how the systems work. And so if you have any questions, whether it's on the record or on background around anything voting or elections, these are great, what I would call inside sources that you're going to want to make sure you're reaching out to. If you are also interested in getting more into some of the other stuff that we care about around campaign finance or ethics, most states, unfortunately not all, most states in this country have an Office of Campaign Finance or some sort of ethics commission. These are great not only for entities that enforce our laws and make sure that folks are abiding by the public interest, but these are also great resources for you all and groups like ours who might have specific questions. They're always happy to answer even hypothetical questions around stories you might be covering. So those are some of the go-tos that I would consider inside sources. Again, there's so many more options. If some of you have state beats or national beats, obviously there's just still helpful resources to help weigh in on some larger discussions, but definitely valuable for local matters. But I also really want to amplify the need to pursue sources who are outside, maybe sources who don't necessarily have access to the power or who aren't typically seen as maybe the go-tos. First and foremost, there are researchers, research institutions, and legal experts who are pretty accessible. You can probably Google them pretty quickly. They are very helpful. One group in particular I want to plug for you all, certainly in the US, they're a great resource, especially around youth voting and youth civic engagement. They're a group out of Tufts University called CIRCLE, which is an acronym for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, long acronym. But they are just a national leader in understanding trends in youth voting and youth civic engagement. So that's one specific example of a research institution that could be really helpful. Maybe you want to do a story on how are young people voting in school committee races? What are we seeing in terms of youth turning out to speak at public events, or how are youth getting more civically engaged on TikTok? A group like CIRCLE would be a tremendously helpful resource to you all. There's obviously issue experts, advocacy groups. Maybe there's a specific issue campaign that groups are working on locally or regionally that you want to highlight or do a story on. Usually they're pretty easy to find out on social media. They might even have a website. Groups like ours even have built out capacity to have communication support. And then watchdog groups like NEFAC and Common Cause, we're really happy to be a resource to you all. I have to plug real quick my colleagues Dara Silvestra and Dev Chatterjee. Dara in particular, who is our regional communications person. Dara comes to us really wanting to make sure that not only we're able to have a good relationship with reporters, but also if there are reporters who are interested in democracy stories and they want information on background, Dara is definitely a great contact. We can make sure we get you Dara's email address. Dara also has a background in public records and FOIA advocacy, so there's that added benefit as well. Really, really important, especially you all with local beats, really important are familiarizing yourself with local nonprofits engaged in civic engagement work. So there are a lot of groups who are nonpartisan groups who aren't necessarily worried about who's winning elections, but more so worried about getting more people engaged, getting more people to vote, getting more people civically active in other matters. Most communities have some sort of neighborhood group or nonprofit group that's leading on this really important, really local civic engagement work. You're going to get a lot of great ideas for stories from those groups. They're always active. They're not heating up for an election or cooling down after an election. They're always on the go. And there's some really, really great stories that aren't covered a lot from some of those nonprofit groups. So would certainly encourage you all to familiarize yourself with who are the active players in your community. Also really important, you're probably already doing this, but if not, I recommend it. Find the municipal social media groups, mostly on Facebook. There's usually that kind of town or city group where people are discussing upcoming events. I mean, this is just the 21st century public market, and it's really valuable for you all to be plugged into it. Oftentimes, issues might arise and conversations happen in these municipal groups that then end up a week later becoming motions before city council or town councils. So it's a really good way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of the people. Not everything's going to be glamorous. Not everything's going to inspire you to want to write about it, but I'm sure you'll certainly get some good ideas out of there as well. Also on Twitter, if you're not already doing this, I recommend if you are on Twitter, you can create a group where you can group together folks that you follow. So maybe there's individual leaders, community leaders, or resource experts out there that are on Twitter that you might want to follow and put together in a group. And that way you can kind of, without having to put a ton of time or energy into it, you can kind of see prioritized content around what's going on in this space. And that might be a really helpful, albeit simple way for you all to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of issues too. Lastly, this might feel simple. Anyone with lived experience, I really want to plug this because one of our big values at Common Cause is making sure that we're really empowering everyday people to become more involved in civic matters and more engaged with their government. And so I think oftentimes we run the risk of implicitly thinking that there's a certain level of expertise in a title or an affiliation. Maybe they belong to an organization or they're at some prestigious university. I would also really encourage you all to consider the expertise in people who just have lived experience. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on the last slide here. So I wanted to just plug these 4 big issues. I think they're the kind of items that are hot right now in the democracy space. They have extremely local implications. I think you're going to really be able to tell some important stories here in the near future. The first is, the impact of new voting laws. Not every state, but most states in the United States have passed, for better or worse, that's the plus or minus, for better or worse, new voting laws. And so, they are now being implemented, last fall or this coming year with municipal elections might be the first time these new systems are being utilized by voters. So it's going to be a really important time to tell those very local stories of how voters are interacting with these new opportunities to vote or new restrictions. What are the opinion of local election officials, town or city clerks? How are they handling these new rules? What's their thought on the public reaction? And then obviously those civic engagement groups who are working to get more people involved. What do they think about these new options for voting? Are they helping? Are they hurting? Are we increasing voter turnout? So these are really great stories that you're going to potentially be seeing play out, especially this year on the local level. The next timely democracy issue that's really important, you probably know this, is every 10 years, states are required to redraw their maps for their legislative districts or other government districts. This also happens very locally through re-precincting, where precinct maps are redrawn. And these are really important because we only do them every 10 years. And last year, we just completed doing redistricting and re-precincting across the country here in the US. And so it's going to be a really good time to get a sense from neighborhood groups or voters on the very local level about the impact. How are their thoughts about maybe having a new district? Maybe they used to be in a city council district and now they're in a new one. And so I think that coverage is really important because it's, part of our democracy is that representation component. But also redistricting is unfortunately just not yet that dinner table issue that people are talking about. So I think it's important also for you all to consider it for your beats to help get the word out and make sure folks know that when they go to vote this year, they might be voting in a different precinct than they're familiar with. Another issue that's really timely and really important, especially after the last few years and in the United States in particular, we've been really paying closer attention to structural racism and undoing white supremacy, is the idea that we call at Common Cause justice and democracy. What this is really centered around is the idea that the mass incarceration systems that we put in place in this country, I think folks are probably familiar, have had a direct negative impact. That's my editorial, direct impact on individuals' voting rights. But even more broadly, they have a really broad impact on folks' ability to become civically engaged and just engage in democracy. There's a lot of great things happening, what we'd say behind the wall with individuals and groups who are doing group activities. They're engaged in civic matters while they're incarcerated. And that might be a really neat story that you all could consider, especially if there's some sort of local project going on. Here in Massachusetts, we recently passed last year a voting reform that made sure that the 7,000 to 9,000 incarcerated voters who are still eligible to vote in Massachusetts have better systems to be able to vote while they're incarcerated that they haven't had before. So that's really on the county and local level. We'll be interested this year in particular to see how that's impacting voter turnout for folks who are incarcerated but otherwise still eligible. So I just wanted to plug that. That's definitely a timely item in democracy overall, is making sure that when all the research shows that increased civic engagement while incarcerated leads to reduced recidivism rates, that we really start telling those stories about the intersection between justice, reform, and democracy. Lastly, and then I'm going to wrap it up, is the conversation happening around virtual public access. So Justin and I, NEFAC, Common Cause, and some of our other partners, ACLU in Massachusetts, we're in this moment where during the pandemic, there was an expansion made to the public that allowed for public participation with open meetings, especially on the local level, city council, town meetings, where instead of having to go into a building physically, you could log on like this virtually and attend. Well, a lot of those expansions were temporary. And so we're now looking ahead at ways that those could be made permanent. And so definitely a good story you might want to consider on your local level about, how people feel about perhaps making this expanded access permanent, what the benefits are. And, you'll want to reach out, especially local cable access organizations who've been covering and helping to make these expansions happen. They'd be great sources. Again, your city and town clerks. And really important, the benefit that we see is the increased access for folks with disabilities. So, great sources on the local stage too to reach out to about this one are disability access groups. So these are a few ideas. I really hope it gave you some new thoughts about how you can plug more into democracy issues, thinking about democracy as intersectional, expanding our definition to be a little bit more than politics, and really bringing it to the local around civic engagement, what groups and individuals are doing in a meaningful way there. And again, there's plenty of resources, and us at NEFAC's a tremendous resource. Our team at Common Cause, we're happy to be supportive as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Geoff. I appreciate all your time, all of your guidance on these really important issues. And a big thanks to everyone who was able to join us today. A reminder, if you found today's class helpful in any way, please consider becoming a sustaining member of NEFAC at nefac.org/join. Your annual support is what makes classes like this one happen. So please consider making a contribution today. I want to thank you all again for being here, and we'll see you next month for our next 30-minute skills. Take care.